Hi everyone, it's Dr. Marks, and our topic for today is imperfect competition. Now remember, we've already talked about the model of perfect competition, so we're talking about those market structures moving to the right in our spectrum. All right, let's get started. So we actually have already introduced two examples of imperfect competition. Now we didn't call it imperfect competition at the time, but that's what we were talking about. So again, we're talking about those models to the right on our spectrum when we had perfect competition, and then we had three other models to the right. Think about what happens as we move along that spectrum. We introduce some market power, right? Perfect competition, we learned, has no market power, but as we move to the right towards monopoly, we start to see market power. So first we talked about the model of monopolistic competition, and then moving further down on the spectrum, we talked about the model of oligopoly. So let's start by reviewing those two market structures. So starting with monopolistic competition, remember we said we're talking about a situation where we have a large number of buyers and sellers. So again, what's the implication? Large number of buyers and sellers means that no one buyer or no one seller is so big that they can dominate the market in any way. They're just one little teeny tiny portion of the whole market. Second, they're selling slightly differentiated products. Now we should put a star next to that because remember that's the big change from perfect competition. In perfect competition, they were selling identical products, making them perfect substitutes, but here we have slightly differentiated products. So these products are substitutes, they might even be close substitutes, but they're no longer perfect substitutes. And then finally, we have free entry and free exit. So there's an ease of entry and ease of exit. We don't have these huge barriers to entry that would be keeping others out. So some examples that might fall into this might be shampoo or breakfast cereal or clothing manufacturers, right? We have a whole bunch of producers in each of those markets, and they're selling similar products, right? Shampoo is similar to other kinds of shampoo, but we might have a favorite. We might like one better than the other for its smell or the way it makes our hair feel. So they're slightly differentiated, but they're pretty close substitutes. Now, if we go a little bit further to the right on the spectrum, we have the model of oligopoly. And remember, this was a pretty big departure. So I told you the jump between monopolistic competition and oligopoly is pretty big. So now we've got a few very large firms, and those firms could be offering homogeneous products or it could be heterogeneous products. We have examples of both. There are barriers to entry here. And so we talked about barriers to entry like brand name, reputation of the existing firms, the size of the existing firms, their advertising budget could be a barrier to entry. And then finally, we talked about the most important element of oligopoly, which is strategic interdependence, the way they kind of strategically interact with each other. So what might be examples? Well, fast food hamburgers might be an oligopoly because we've got some few key players, right? Think about the burger wars between McDonald's and Burger King, for example. Bookstores might fall into this category. We see really just a few large bookstores remaining. We used to have tons and tons of little bookstores, but now really we've got just major chains that are left. Long distance providers. We may have given that example in class where we've got AT&T and we've got Sprint, for example. But you're probably most familiar with the oligopoly related to cell phone providers. So you've got Verizon, you've got T-Mobile, you've got Sprint, and they're basically selling the same thing. You can't tell who your call's with. If somebody calls you, you can't say, oh, that's a Verizon line or that's a T-Mobile line. You just don't know. And then automobiles, another example. So we've talked about soft drinks as well. Anyway, you get the idea. These are what we're talking about with respect to imperfect competition. All right? So we're going to focus mostly on oligopoly. And the reason really is very simple. It's just more interesting. And why is it more interesting? Because of that strategic interdependence. So remember, in class we talked about, for example, Coke and Pepsi. They don't say, oh, wow, Coke did something. They say, wait, Coke is doing this, so we better follow it. We better counteract it. That we have just a few firms here, and because we have just a few firms, it creates this very strategic relationship. And so remember, when we talk about strategic interdependence, we're saying that what firm A does impacts the other few firms. And of course, what firm B does affects everybody else. And so imagine Coke and Pepsi. What Coke does affects Pepsi. What Pepsi does affects Coke. And they're going to make decisions based on this idea. And so it's highly strategic. And so remember, in class, we even watched some Coke and Pepsi commercials. And they're actually picking on each other in the commercials, if you remember that, right? And so that's a great example of strategic interdependence coming through in advertising. Now, one thing we need to note here is that when we're talking about oligopoly and we have just a few firms, firms might be better off with collusion. So what we want to talk about for a little bit is this incentive for collusion. And by collusion, I mean that they all act in an agreed upon way. So rather than competing with each other, they all get together and say, hey, let's all do this. And that way they don't have as much competition with each other. So we want to talk a little bit about this idea of collusion. Now, one great example of collusion is a cartel. So when colluding, firms might actually act as a cartel. So when we talk about a cartel, we're talking about a group of firms, but specifically, the group of firms mimics a monopoly. So it's a group of firms that are going to mimic a monopoly. So let's think about what it would mean to mimic a monopoly, because we've already studied monopoly. So let's think about what we know about a monopoly, right? A monopoly charges higher prices, and a monopoly produces less. And we're talking about relative to perfect competition. So again, what does a monopoly do? It charges higher prices, it produces less. So that's that idea that we've already talked about in class called contrived scarcity. So relative to a perfectly competitive industry, monopolies are going to have higher prices and they're going to have less output, making it kind of artificially more scarce. So an example of a cartel that you're probably already familiar with is OPEC. So we're going to use OPEC as one of our examples. Now you might be thinking, well, who is OPEC? So if you're not sure who OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So we're going to be specifically talking about OPEC as a cartel, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Now, OPEC was started in 1960, so this has been around for a really long time. But when it started with only 5 nations. So OPEC initially was relatively small, at least a lot smaller than it is now, with just 5 nations, and those nations were Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Venezuela, right? All countries known to be exporters of oil. So those were the cartel members back in 1960. Now, membership has varied. I've seen some lists that differ from what it is today, but when I looked it up today, and as I record this in 2019, there are 14 nations. Now, membership may change again. For example, Qatar just left in early 2019. So as I record this, just 10 months ago, Qatar withdrew from Kuwait and withdrew from OPEC, and now there's talk about Ecuador leaving OPEC because Ecuador is having this financial crisis, and so they may not really be able to kind of remain an active member under the OPEC rules. So we don't want to get too much into that, but we do want to understand that OPEC has grown in nations, at least from 1960, but we've seen countries come and countries go. Now, I know this is just a little bit blurry, but this is the best I could do because I was looking for more recent information. And so this is from the OPEC Annual Statistical Bulletin. And this is looking at OPEC's share of world crude oil reserves in 2018. So let's start by looking at the left side of the graph. And we see that OPEC controls what? Almost 80% of the world's crude oil reserves, right? 79.4%, which means non-OPEC countries control only 20.6%. So those countries that are members of OPEC control almost 80% of the world's oil reserves. And you can see them listed on the right. So we've got, and you don't need to write these down, but let's just take a look. We've got Algeria, Angola, Congo, Ecuador, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon. You've got Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia. You've got the United Arab Emirates, and you've got Venezuela. And if you look at the pie chart on the right, you see the relative composition of those countries in terms of how they comprise this blue area in the pie chart on the left. So again, lots of different nations that are oil exporters have gotten together, they've formed a cartel, and again, they're coordinating strategically to act like a monopoly. Now, as I just said, the goal of a cartel is coordination. They're trying to coordinate. But what is it exactly that they're trying to coordinate on? Well, they want to coordinate on two things: production and pricing of oil. So they want to control production and they want to set price. And they want to do that together as a group. So what we see here then, OPEC, who owns a large percentage of the world's oil reserve, because they have so much control, obviously they can heavily influence the market, at least in theory. So in theory, they can heavily impact the market. So basically the idea here is, since they have so much ability to influence the market, OPEC firms agree to limit production. So let's think about that. They're getting together, they know they can influence the market because they have such a large percentage of the world's oil reserves, and they agree to limit production. So think about this, guys. How does this tie into supply and demand? If OPEC firms agree together to limit production, so total production is going to be limited, do you agree that what they're really doing is creating decreases in supply? So instead of them all competing against each other and producing as much as they want, they agree to limit their production, which causes a decrease in supply. Now, if you're going to have a decrease in supply by limiting production, now you've got to decide how much each of the nations in OPEC can produce. So what they do is they have a quota system. Basically what they do is divide up the total supply and say, you get to produce this much and this other country gets to produce this much. Everybody's assigned a share of the quota. Ultimately, what is this going to do to price? It's obviously going to impact the market price, right? So guys, do we agree that theoretically, if OPEC can influence the market by limiting production, which we just said decreases supply, they're going to have an impact on the market price? And hopefully you could draw that for me, right? Because this is simply a supply and demand question. So guys, what is this going to look like if I asked you to graph it? Well, do you agree it's going to look like this graph right here? So everyone agree that what we're seeing with OPEC acting as a cartel is that they decrease supply. So we had market supply 1, but now supply decreases to S2. What's the ultimate effect here on market price? Well, price went from P1 to P2. So we see an increase in market price, right? And look at the demand curve. We've drawn it to be fairly steep, right? Closer to vertical than horizontal, right? So what does that tell us about the market demand for oil? It tells us that the market demand for oil is relatively inelastic. Well, let's think about it. What would make demand relatively inelastic? Well, lack of substitutes, right? I need oil. There's not alternatives really for oil, so demand's going to be relatively inelastic, at least in the short run. So let's think about it for a second, right? Oil is used for gas, and so oil affects gas prices. Now, in the short run, if oil prices were to go up, making gas prices go up, I need to get to work. So do you agree that in the short run, I might not change my behavior all that much? But is there anything that I could do in the long run? Well, in the long run, do you agree I could get a more fuel efficient car? I could find people to carpool with. I could move and live closer to my job. So that's why we say here that the demand for oil is relatively inelastic, at least in the short run. It's going to be at least more inelastic in the short run than in the long run. So because our demand curve is relatively inelastic, it's somewhat steep, do you agree that that's going to cause a bigger price increase? So think about it. If that demand curve had been almost horizontal, the price increase wouldn't be that big, right? So OPEC knows that if it can successfully cut its supply, it will jack up the world's oil prices, at least in theory. So historically, this has been the situation for OPEC, acting as a cartel. We're going to talk a little bit more about what has happened more recently. So more recently, OPEC's powers diminished. So that's why I keep saying theoretically we would see this. There's been a lot of internal conflict between the countries that comprise OPEC. But also there's been more impact from non-OPEC producers of oil. Remember, while OPEC controls a huge amount of the world's oil supply, they're not the only game in town, and there are other countries. But we also have to think about our dependence on oil. Certainly we're still dependent on oil, but we've seen development of alternative energies. The more development of alternative energies, certainly that's going to strip power away from OPEC, and has. And so all of these things make it harder for OPEC to maintain a successful cartel. And so when you read about OPEC, you don't read about them being the kind of cartel that they used to be. And of course, all of this is going to lead to more stress between OPEC nations. And it only works as a cartel if they can work together, if they can agree. And so OPEC isn't the strength that it used to be, but it's certainly still a great example of a cartel. All right, so now that we understand what we mean by collusion and we understand what we mean by being a cartel, let's move on to talk about this idea of collusion and uncompetitive practices, because that goes hand in hand with this kind of idea. So firms can be better off when they collude, right? Sometimes they'd rather collude and kind of agree to behave in a certain way rather than compete against each other, right? That makes sense. But there are laws to protect consumers. We don't want firms colluding. We're worse off when firms collude. And so there are laws built in to protect us from these collusion opportunities and uncompetitive practices of firms. So you might have heard about the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, or another one you may be familiar with is the Clayton Act of 1914. And we're not going to get too into these, but the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 and the Clayton Act of 1914 are in place to protect us from uncompetitive practices and bad behaviors on the part of firms. And so that's good. That's going to help us. So let me give you some examples. And this is a great example from my own alma mater. I went to Texas A&M for both my undergraduate and my graduate programs. And Texas A&M is a huge school. When I was there, it was 40-something thousand. Now I think it's up to 60-something thousand, which means it has multiple bookstores. So it's different than how things work at Longwood, because we only need one bookstore. But at Texas A&M, when I was there was something like 5 different bookstores. I'm willing to bet there are a lot more bookstores now. But here's what those bookstores did. They got together and they agreed to set prices. Now, remember, they're supposed to compete against each other. But instead of competing against each other, they said, hey, let's sit down and have lunch. Let's have an agreement that instead of competing against each other, which drives prices down, which is good for consumers but bad for them, they're going to agree to not compete. So the agreement between those bookstores was to not compete against each other. And of course, when they don't compete against each other, that allowed them to keep higher prices. Now, you'd think maybe somebody would have an incentive to undercut, but it actually was successful, and they were investigated, and it was found that this was indeed true. What was the objective here for these firms? To make more money, right? So we're all going to charge $150 for this book, and everyone agrees, because if we compete against each other, maybe the price falls to $120, and then we're all worse off. At least the firms are worse off. But of course, consumers are better off when firms don't collude. So this would have been an example of illegal behavior. And if you're found doing something like this, you can get in a lot of trouble. So there are regulations in place against that kind of behavior, collusion, but there's also other uncompetitive practices that are illegal. And these are things we don't hear that much about, but I want to give you a few examples. So some of these other uncompetitive practices. For example, it's illegal to have predatory prices. So it's illegal to predatory price your product. Now, what do I mean by predatory price? What we're talking about is cutting the price of your product with the intent of driving out your competition. So predatory pricing is the idea of cutting your price for your product with the intent of driving out your competition. Now, hopefully you're thinking, but wait, isn't that what competition is all about? And the answer is yes. But there are things you can do and things you can't do. But there's clearly lots of gray areas. So first, let me make sure you're clear. It is not illegal to lower your price. It is perfectly legal, right? Go to Walmart. Don't they have signs up all the time that says, we've lowered our price? So it's not illegal to lower your price. Of course, we want firms lowering their price. That's good for consumers. It's not even illegal to sell at a loss. If a firm wants to put something on clearance and take a loss, they can. So again, back to Walmart. Do we sometimes see things sold for ridiculously low prices on clearance? And you're like, wow, they've got to be losing money. One of my friends put something on Facebook. She has a baby, and they were selling baby clothes for 25 cents an item, probably taking a loss on those items. So that's not illegal. So it's not illegal to lower your price. It's not even illegal to sell at a loss. So your intent clearly has something to do with it. Your intent. Why are you doing these things? Now, if you're putting baby clothes on clearance because they're Halloween themed and Halloween is over, your intent is just to get rid of your inventory. There's nothing wrong with that. So we have to think about, what is the probability that your behavior can lead to monopolization of an industry? What's the probability that your behavior as the firm can lead to monopolization of an industry? Now let's think about it. When Walmart decides to charge 25 cents for baby clothes because they have pumpkins all over them, is that going to lead to a monopoly of an industry? Probably not, right? That is not creating a monopoly in baby clothes for Walmart. So somebody would look at that and say, that probably doesn't violate any law. The intent is to get rid of the baby clothes, to get them out of the inventory because they're no longer in season because Halloween is past. It's not going to create monopoly power, so this is not a problem. But if the intent is to create more monopoly power for yourself, then that's a whole nother story. So let me illustrate this by another example. Let's say that I lower my prices below my own average cost. So I lower my price below my average cost, so I'm selling at a loss, in order to prevent a new firm from entering the market. So basically, I'm using predatory pricing by selling at a loss to keep somebody else out of the market. And then after they fail, this new firm can't enter, or they fail, I'm going to raise my prices up again. Well, that's a whole different situation, right? Now, if I'm just one of many firms, this isn't going to really do that much, right? If I'm one of many firms, then I probably can't myself keep a new firm from entering. But what if I'm one of few firms? What if this is an oligopoly and I'm one of just 2 or 3 or 4 firms? Could this drive others out? Yeah, it could. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we say, look, how does this impact the probability that monopoly power is generated here? And if you have the ability to sell at a loss and keep others out of your market, you're creating monopoly power. So, your behavior in this example, if you're one of few firms in an oligopoly, could lead to some monopolies, right? And so that could be a violation of these acts that we just talked about. So again, I'm back to the idea that intent matters. Can I lower my prices? Yes. Can I sell at a loss? Yes. If I'm just trying to get stuff off my shelves that I don't want in my store anymore, absolutely. If I'm doing it to be strategic, to prevent competition, if it's going to help lead me to be a monopoly, then it's illegal. And again, I'm keeping it very, very simple. Now, another example of uncompetitive behavior is tying contracts. It's illegal to have what we call tying contracts. Tying contracts are where we're offering 2 products together at a single price. You're offering 2 products together at a single price. Now, you might be thinking, but wait, don't we see that? Don't we see shampoo and conditioner sold together as a set at Walmart? Sure. But you can buy the conditioner by itself. You can buy the shampoo by itself. And this is not going to create any monopoly power, right? So remember the idea. Does it create monopoly power? All right, so tying contracts. We're offering 2 products together at a single price. And if you want one, you have to buy the other. If you want one, you have to buy the other, even if you don't want it. So there's something I want or something I need, and for me to be able to get it, I've got to buy this whole other product that I didn't want. Now, generally, we're talking about a situation where the second product is in a market where the firm is not dominant. So let's think about that. Maybe I have strength in the first product, but I tie it to a second product where I don't have a lot of strength. So I've got some power over you for the first product, but I'm going to tie it to my second product where maybe I'm not quite as successful. Hopefully you're kind of getting the hang of it. This is strategic. I'm trying to create sales and keep you as the consumer from having a choice. So let me give you an example, because I realize it's probably still a little fuzzy, and this is going to make it very clear. And I believe this was a real-world example because I would not have made this up. So let's say that a firm makes a schizophrenia drug, and they hold the patent. And if they hold the patent, that means they're the only ones offering it. All right, so you're basically a monopoly, right? You've got a patent on this schizophrenia pharmaceutical product, and you're the only game in town. But for consumers who wanted this schizophrenia drug, they also had to purchase blood monitoring services from this company. So let's think about it. This is a tying contract, right? Schizophrenia drugs can only be obtained if you also buy the blood monitoring service as well. So they've tied 2 products together. They've tied one that they're very dominant in, right, the schizophrenia drug, because they have the patent, and probably they have a lot of competition for blood monitoring services. So this is an uncompetitive practice. Basically what this did for people is that it raised the price of medical treatment. If you were a schizophrenic and you needed this drug, it made it a lot more expensive than it would have been if these 2 things had not been tied together. So that's a problem. But the other thing is that it prevented other companies from offering blood monitoring services as well, right? So there's competition, but now those competitors aren't going to get as much business because people have to buy this tied together schizophrenia drug and blood monitoring service package, all right? So that's an uncompetitive practice. It's unfair. It is reducing the competition, and it's with the intent to create monopoly power. So back to my original example with Walmart. Walmart packages shampoo and conditioner together. Is that a tying contract that's illegal? No. You can buy the conditioner by itself, you can buy the shampoo by itself. It doesn't really create reduced competition. It doesn't really create any monopoly power. It just maybe gives you a price discount if you want to buy the two together. So that would not be illegal, but this example with the schizophrenia drug would be illegal. So hopefully you see the difference there. All right. Now, hopefully you understand that collusion and uncompetitive practices can be good for firms, right? If you're a firm that's colluding or doing something uncompetitive, you're doing it to make yourself better off, clearly. So at least to those who are involved in the practices, right, the firms that are doing these things, they're probably benefiting from them. But as we've already mentioned, these things are bad for consumers, all right? So the firms that behave this way are doing it to get more market power, to reduce competition for their products. But as with the schizophrenia example, it raised the cost of medical care. It raised the cost of that pharmaceutical product. So it's bad for customers. All right, so enough about these uncompetitive practices. So collusion, uncompetitive practices like predatory pricing and tying contracts, they're illegal for a reason. It reduces competition, it makes consumers worse off. It's an unfair practice. All right, so back to this idea of oligopoly. Now, we've already talked about that the really interesting thing about oligopoly is the interdependence, right? It's that interdependence, that strategic interdependence, that's a key element of oligopoly, and that's why it's really interesting, right? So we can see in this world of interdependence how there might be incentives to collude. And so I want to illustrate how there could be incentives to collude if we're in the model of oligopoly. Now, the way we're going to illustrate this is through game theory. So game theory is used to illustrate incentive structures. And so we're going to use a little bit of game theory, and some of you probably have been exposed to some game theory, but there's one famous model that's really applicable here in this example of oligopoly and collusion, and that is prisoner's dilemma. So we're going to use this famous model of the prisoner's dilemma. And we're going to use it in a few different contexts. So you do need to understand these game theoretic implications and what we're going to do, okay? All right, so the prisoner's dilemma. Now, we're going to start by talking about just the basic prisoner's dilemma model, but then we'll look at it in the context of firm behavior. So let's say that two people commit a crime, and they both get caught. So they both are now apprehended. They're in a police office, and they're put in separate rooms for interrogation, and that's really, really important. So if they're put in separate rooms, then understand that they cannot talk to each other. If they could talk to each other, they might be able to coordinate, they might be able to collude, but this means they can't. So they're in separate rooms, keeping them away from each other, unable to discuss the situation. Now, both people are offered a chance to testify against the other for a reduced sentence, or maybe even no sentence. So they basically are going to be split up, and they're going to say, look, if you want to turn state's evidence against your partner, we'll reduce your sentence or commute your sentence. So you've got this incentive. And you guys have seen this on shows like Law and Order, right? So two people commit a crime, and they interrogate him in two different rooms, and they say, hey, the first one to take this deal gets this deal. I know you've seen this a million times. However, in this case, without more evidence, both partners can only get charged with a lesser crime. So If they keep their mouth shut, then both get charged with a lesser crime. But if one turns on the other, they get an even shorter sentence. All right? So what we're going to do is convert this scenario right here into a game. So we've got two individuals, Bonnie and Clyde. And hopefully you get the movie reference there, Bonnie and Clyde, right? A famous duo. So they've got two strategies. They can keep quiet or they can confess. Now remember, if they confess and the other doesn't, then they're turning state's evidence on the other. So we need to make sure that we understand how to read this. Now, Clyde is going to choose a row in this game. Keep quiet or confess, right? So he's choosing a row, top row, bottom row. Bonnie's choosing a column, middle column or right column. And so the intersection of those are going to tell us what our outcomes are. Now, the first number in the box gives us Clyde's sentence, and the second number gives us Bonnie's sentence. So, for example, if they both keep quiet, they both get 1 year. But if Bonnie keeps quiet and Clyde confesses, we go down to 0 years for Clyde, 15 years for Bonnie. All right, so we're going to practice with this. Now, do we agree that they're best off if they both keep quiet? So, Clyde says he'll keep quiet, Bonnie says she'll keep quiet, and do you agree that we're going to end up in that first box, right? So, Clyde's chosen a row, Bonnie's chosen a column, they both keep quiet. So do you agree that that's going to put us in this outcome right here? 1 year, 1 year. So they're each going to get sentenced to 1 year. Remember that the first is Clyde's sentence, the second is Bonnie's sentence. So 1 year for Clyde, 1 year for Bonnie. And so that's a pretty good outcome. But remember, they are not together. So they cannot discuss this. All they can do is hope that maybe each other keeps their mouth shut, but they can't even put any pressure on each other. Now, for us, as I just said, to get to that outcome, Bonnie and Clyde would want to coordinate, right? They'd want to collude. So coordination would be like our cartel, with all of the nations deciding to coordinate and act in a certain way. But they're separated, right? So they cannot discuss this, and that's going to make this outcome a lot harder to get to. But also remember, they're criminals, right? Bonnie's a criminal and Clyde's a criminal. So even if they could discuss it, maybe they would cheat on the agreement, right? So they might say, oh, you know, Clyde, I love you so much, let's both keep quiet. And Clyde says, oh, Bonnie, I love you too, let's both keep quiet. 1 year for each of us, we can do that. And then as soon as they separate, well, maybe self-preservation is going to outweigh love, and Bonnie's going to say, well, sorry, Clyde, but I can make my circumstance a lot better off if I confess and they convict you with me testifying, right? All right, so you see what's going to happen here. So where we're going with this is we want to ask ourselves if this outcome right here, keep quiet, is an equilibrium. All right? So is that outcome where Clyde keeps quiet and Bonnie keeps quiet, is it an equilibrium? So what do we mean by equilibrium? By equilibrium, in this context, we mean it's a point of stability, but it means something very specific. So it's a point of stability, but specifically, we're looking to see if it's what we call a Nash equilibrium. A Nash equilibrium. So we want to know if it's a point of stability in the Nash equilibrium sense. So we need to define what we mean by Nash equilibrium. When we talk about a Nash equilibrium, we're saying that given what the other is doing, no one wants to change his or her strategy. So what that means is, given what Clyde is doing, which is keep quiet, Bonnie does not want to change her strategy. And if Bonnie keeps quiet, Clyde does not want to change his strategy. That's what's required for this to be a Nash equilibrium. In other words, nobody wants to change their mind given what the other is doing. Okay? So we're going to take a look at this and see if this outcome, keep quiet, where they each get a year in jail, is an equilibrium. All right. So remember, Clyde chooses a row. So he's going to keep quiet. Now let's take a look at this for a second. If Clyde is keeping quiet, now Bonnie's got to decide what she would want to do. And she gets to choose a row, a column. So she can either keep quiet or she can confess. Now, if Clyde keeps quiet, what does Bonnie want to do? Does she still want to keep quiet? Because if she keeps quiet, she gets a year in jail, right? What's her incentive? What does she want to do? Does everyone agree that she can roll over on Clyde by confessing, and then she can be a witness against Clyde, and her time actually gets reduced to 0? So if Bonnie's not super in love with Clyde, or she's not a very trustworthy person, or if she cares about her own well-being more than she cares about Clyde, then she's not going to keep quiet. So hopefully you see that what we had before is not an equilibrium, because Bonnie would want to change her mind. Now, let's look at it from Clyde's perspective. So let's say that Bonnie says, oh, I love Clyde so much, I'm going to keep quiet. Well, now Clyde has to choose a row. So he can keep quiet or confess. Well, let's take a look. Do we agree that if Bonnie keeps quiet, what does Clyde want to do? Well, if he keeps quiet, he gets a year. Or if he confesses and he's a witness against Bonnie, what happens? So he can roll over on Bonnie, confess, and now his time is reduced to 0. So do you agree that by the time they both defect on any kind of idea that they both keep quiet, we end up with both of them confessing, 9 years in jail for each of them? Now, I want to be very clear that I'm not saying that we say, hey, Clyde, Bonnie does this. And we're not saying, hey, Bonnie, Clyde did this. The idea of an equilibrium is a theoretical one. So theoretically, if Bonnie did this, what would Clyde want to do? And theoretically, if one behaves this way, what does the other want to do? So basically, we're not saying they know with certainty what each other's doing. We're simply just saying, is this in theory a stable outcome? And the answer was no. Now, when both of them deviate here, do we agree that they end up in a worse situation? That if they end up both trying to confess so that they can be a witness against the other, now they end up in a worse situation because they could have had 1 year each, but now they've got 9 years. But here's the deal. Do we agree that 9 years is better than 15 years? And certainly 15 years would have been the outcome for one of them if the other had confessed, right? So if one confesses and the other is quiet, they would be in jail for 15 years. So it's better than that option, but certainly not what they would have been hoping for. Now again, remember, they can't discuss this. So I'm not saying that we put them together and let them discuss it. I'm just saying we're looking at the theoretic properties of the game. All right. And again, even if they could discuss, even if we put Bonnie and Clyde together in a room and they both say, oh, I love you so much, let's keep quiet. Oh, I love you too, let's keep quiet. As soon as they separate them again, depending on how devious they are, that agreement may not have held up. All right, so what we're saying then is our initial 1 year and 1 year outcome where they both keep quiet is not an equilibrium. It wasn't a point of stability, but confess is an equilibrium. So let's look at this for a second. Again, we have to ask ourselves the question, can anyone deviate and make themselves better off? So, does Clyde want to change his mind? What happens if he keeps quiet? If he keeps quiet, he goes to 15 years. And does Bonnie want to change her mind? If Clyde is confessing and Bonnie keeps quiet, she's going to get 15 years. None of that is better than where they are now, right? So what we have here is what we call a dominant strategy, and that's a game theoretic property. A dominant strategy is a strategy that's best when you don't know what the other will do. So if I don't know what Bonnie's doing, what's the best choice for me? So it's the strategy that's best when you don't know what the other will do. So there's a clear dominant strategy here. In this case, the strategy we would nickname mini-max. Minimize the maximum. In other words, your best strategy is to minimize the maximum amount of jail time. So mini-max. Minimize the maximum jail time. So minimize the maximum prison time. So minimize the maximum, or mini-max. So let's take a look. If Clyde keeps quiet and he doesn't know what Bonnie's going to do, let's look at this game. If Clyde keeps quiet, then what do we know? He's going to get either 1 year or 15 years, right? Well, how did I get 1 year? So he keeps quiet. Well, if Bonnie also keeps quiet, he gets 1 year. But if Bonnie confesses, he gets 15 years, right? And if Clyde confesses, so now let's move him to that row. If he confesses, well, he gets either 0 years or 9 years, right? It depends on whether Bonnie keeps quiet or Bonnie confesses, right? So if those are your options, you're going to get 1 year or 15 years if she behaves one way, or rather if you behave one way, or you're going to get 0 or 9 years if you behave another way. What's the best thing for you to do here? Well, if we're minimizing the max, right, we want to know which is mini-max. We want to minimize the maximum jail time. Then which one would you go with? 1 and 15 or 0 and 9? Well, your dominant strategy here would be to confess, right? So Clyde's dominant strategy, the thing that minimizes his maximum sentence, is to confess. And it's going to turn out to be the same for Bonnie. So Bonnie has exactly the same situation, right? So this is how we get to that outcome of confess, confess, which is an equilibrium, but it also makes them both worse off than if they colluded and kept their mouth shut, right? Keep quiet, where they only get 1 year. So this is the famous prisoner's dilemma. So what you see here is we could try to collude, keep quiet, only get 1 year, but there's an incentive to deviate on that agreement. So let's look at how this might translate into the OPEC situation. We understand it for Bonnie and Clyde, but now let's look at a more real-world scenario. So remember, we talked about a few minutes ago that each nation in OPEC is going to agree to their quota, right? They're going to be assigned some number of barrels of oil, for example, and they need to stick to that, because remember what the whole cartel is trying to do. They're trying to reduce output, and that only works if everyone sticks to their quota. But a nation might have an incentive to cheat on the quota, right? Think about it. Maybe I'm assigned 5,000 barrels. I'm just making up a number, but 5,000 barrels. Well, what if I produce 5,500? I can make just a little bit more. And I'm not going to override the whole cartel situation because it's just a little bit more. And clearly I'll make a little bit more money. So nations might have a little bit of an incentive to cheat here and make a little bit more money. So cheating would mean producing a little bit more than the quota. Now, if they're the only one that's cheating, then the cartel's still going to function, right? There's only 500 extra barrels of oil here when I cheat, and that's just a small share because there's 14 nations in this cartel, right? But what happens if a bunch of nations cheat? What if everyone decides that they're going to produce 10% more? By the time we all produce 10% more, now we're not going to have a good outcome, because now we've just undone the whole point of the cartel, right? The whole point of the cartel was to keep output artificially low. So let's look at an example, and so that we can put it in a game, I had to just look at a two-country model. So we've got Iran and Iraq, and let's just kind of assume that they're the cartel, and they have two choices. They could abide by the quota, or they could cheat on the quota. So I've circled in purple the collusive, the cartel agreement in my purple circle, right? So if they both abide by the quota, they're in that bottom right, and they're both making $20 million. And so if you look at that, that's pretty good compared to their other options. But here's the problem. Is this an equilibrium? Well, if we're right there, then do we agree that Iran has an incentive to cheat, right? If they cheat on their quota by producing a little bit more, instead of making $20 million, they can make $23 million. So what I have in purple is not an equilibrium, because if others are going to stick to the quota, then Iran wants to cheat. But here's the problem. Iraq has that same incentive, because if the others are going to stick to their quota, then Iraq, who's the second number in that pair, goes from making 20 million to 23 million. So they're better off as well to cheat. So by the time they both cheat, right, they cheat and they cheat. Now we're not in this purple outcome anymore, right? We're not at 20 million, 20 million. We're going to end up with both of these nations cheating on their quota and ending up at 13 million and 13 million. Now, do we agree that that is not as good as making 20 million? If they had both stuck by the quota, they both would be better off. But that wasn't an equilibrium, because both of them wanted to defect given what the other was doing. So we end up in an equilibrium situation where both Iran and Iraq have cheated on the quota, and it costs them money, right? So this is the prisoner's dilemma situation all over again, but instead of Bonnie and Clyde, we've got Iran and Iraq, but the incentives are still the same. Now, the table works in the opposite direction, right? Our equilibrium was initially in the lower right. So don't assume we're always going to start in the upper left. That may not be the case. You've got to look at the properties and figure it out. So we're agreeing to collude, and Iran cheats, Iraq cheats. When we both do that, we end up here making less money. All right, you get the idea. So let's look at one more example related to advertising. So in this example, we can see how strategic behavior could relate if we were talking about marketing. So let's think through this game for just a second. Okay? We've got the same kind of thing. We've got two players and two strategies, right? In this case, let's say that the firms agree to not advertise. Well, why would they want to agree to not advertise? Well, advertising is expensive, right? So this way they're both going to save money. And if they both decide to not advertise, can you figure out where we are on the graph, on our chart? So we're going to be in that bottom right corner, right? And they're both going to make $4 million, am I right? So we need to ask ourselves, is this an equilibrium outcome? So I'm in the bottom right. Don't advertise, don't advertise. Each of them making $4 million. So take a second and figure out if this is an equilibrium. In other words, does anybody want to deviate? If anybody wants to deviate, then this is not an equilibrium. So, can you figure it out? Anyone have an incentive to start advertising if the other's not going to advertise? So let's take a look. Do we agree here that each of them has an incentive? If they think the other one's not going to advertise, they would want to start to advertise, right? So let's think about what the equilibrium of this game would actually be. So take a second and see if you can figure that out. So we're starting right there. Neither are advertising. So take a second, see if you can think through this. All right, well, let's see if you're on the right track. Do you agree that Camel, who's the orange choice, they realize that if Marlboro's not going to advertise, if they start to advertise, they can go from $4 million to $5 million. But that's as long as Marlboro does not advertise. So basically, Camel has an incentive to cheat on the arrangement. They agreed they weren't going to advertise, and now Camel says, well, you know what, I'm going to show them, I'm going to start advertising, I'm going to make more money. So Camel can cheat on this agreement. And when they cheat on the agreement, do we agree that they make $1 million more? But here's the thing, do we agree that we have that same incentive for Marlboro, right? So take a look. We've got the same incentive. If Marlboro thinks that Camel's not going to advertise, then they would want to switch to advertise, right? So by the time both of them switch to advertise, where do we end up? We end up with both of them advertising, and we've already said advertising is expensive. So when they both cheat, do we agree they're both advertising, which makes them worse off than they were to begin with? They were trying to collude, but they each had an incentive to cheat on the collusion, and now they're worse off because they've got to spend a lot of money on advertising. Now we're in equilibrium, right? So remember how to ask this question. Does anyone want to deviate? They're both advertising. Well, does anyone want to switch to don't advertise? What happens if they switch to don't advertise? Their earnings fall from $3 million to $2 million. So they certainly don't want to do that. So we are in an equilibrium outcome right here. So again, this is also an example of the prisoner's dilemma at work. So hopefully you've got the hang of it. So we've been talking about models of imperfect competition. And specifically, we've been talking about oligopoly because that's the more interesting of the models, right? We see how strategic behavior comes into play here. And we've modeled that using, rather that should say game theory. So we've modeled that using game theory. So make sure you understand how to find the equilibrium outcomes of a game. And if I were to ask you, is something in equilibrium, you need to be able to answer that question as well. So hopefully you get the hang of it. Of course, if you don't, or if you have any specific questions, let me know. And thank you for listening, and have a fantastic day.